I've always dreamt of finding a way to store my minis that would allow me to display them, but also easily transport them when I needed to. I have many fully painted models crammed into storage boxes where they'll never see the light of day, which is really dumb since they all took me so long to paint. There are all sorts of products out there that claim to do this, but the problem is that they're all really expensive. I was poking around Walmart the other day, and I stumbled across these storage bin products. They're nice and strong, but they're also made of this awesome clear plastic that allows us to see the stuff inside of them. I'm not sponsored by these things, I really just found them and immediately realized that I could stack these up next to my hobby desk to store and display my minis. And I could pick them up easily and transport them with me to gaming sessions. And you know the best part? These single large boxes are less than $8 a piece. I put the link in the description if you want to grab a few of these yourself. An obvious problem though with just carrying my minis around in these things is that they could slide around, and in the case of something like Sylvaneth, which is my main Age of Sigmar army, that's a scary prospect because these tiny little branches love to break. I immediately thought, let's magnetize these things. So I bought some magnetic sheets and started playing around with them, but to be honest with you, they don't look very good in the bottom of the box. So then I thought, is there a way to secure these things that might also look nice? And if the title of this video didn't already give it away, there absolutely is. My name is Hero Song, and today we're going to build a diorama that's going to double as a Warhammer miniature carrying case. I started this project by grabbing some foam board, which cost around $3. I also got this at Walmart, but you can probably find it at any big box store near you. I measured the box and cut a nice square piece of my foam board to fit it. I figured I would put it in there to ensure that it fit, and it did. But I did not account for the fact that it would be so snug that I wouldn't be able to get it back out of the box. So I ended up having to cut a small hole in the foam board to get a finger hold to pull it out. That was pretty dumb, but at least we know that this is going to be secure in the bin. I started laying out the models on the foam so that I could get a sense of what would fit in here and where stuff would go. I had to leave a few of my Sylvaneth models out of this box, but it's okay. Given how enjoyable this project was, I'm definitely going to do more of them in the future, so they'll all have a home eventually. What we're going to do here is cut holes in the foam so that models can slot into a spot, which is going to prevent them from moving around as we carry this box. I'm going to start tracing circles around the bases of the models that will sit on this first layer of foam. What I want to do is create some layers in this diorama so that all the models aren't on the same level. This is going to create a little bit more visual intrigue when we look at this thing. I'll have a few models sit at each level as we move upward in the diorama. Before I glued each layer on, I also cut out the circles that its models were going to fit in and confirmed that they were going to fit in there in the right way. This was a somewhat annoying process though. I had to decide what models would be on the current layer, then use that to determine where the next vertical layer could start. I would then cut foam to match the next layer, mark and cut the circles for each model, and then glue the next layer onto the diorama. I made sure to check how tall I could go with this diorama before I got ahead of myself so that I could ensure I wouldn't make one of the models accidentally sit so tall that it would prevent me from stacking stuff on top of this box. I did this process several times until the layers got small enough that I could use scrap foam to cover them. This was also a bit painful since it was hard to measure and cut a circle on several scraps that had to fit together perfectly in the end. In some cases, I glued all the pieces together and then cut the circle out of them, but sometimes that cut actually removed the glue from the pieces. So they all fell apart, but eventually with some effort, I was able to piece all of this together and have it look pretty nice. Now we jump into the part where we start trying to make this all look natural. I'm going to start the way I do with most of my bases by building up a base of torn corkboard. Torn corkboard has a really nice edge that looks very, very natural. We're doing a Sylvaneth army here, so a foresty look really feels right for this diorama, but corkboard can really be used to make any kind of rocky, natural-looking surface. I tear the corkboard into rough shapes to try and make natural-looking areas on my diorama. There's no rules here, but I generally tried to add chunks of cork to large flat spaces that had nothing on them. The forest is very rarely actually flat, so we want to add as much visual clutter and variance as we possibly can to this thing. This also creates more surface and is luckily just about the same thickness as the foam board, but it also creates a very natural looking crumbly edge when you peel the cork back a bit on the corners. I got a massive pack of this stuff from Amazon for like $12, and that came with 4 square feet of corkboard. I've not even gotten through a single square foot in a whole year, even after this project. So I'm going to say that the cost of corkboard for this was like less than a couple dollars. I recognize I'm fudging it a little bit, but hey, hobby stuff is always an investment. I also used some of the leftover bits from tearing and peeling and glued them onto the phone to give a perception of kind of rocks scattered about. I also went ahead and carved some of the large flat edges of the foam board down with my hobby knife to try and get things to look a bit more natural. I also thought this was a great time to break into my Sylvaneth bits that I had left over from my Sylvaneth sprues. I found what I think are some shoulder bits from a Kurnoth Hunter, and with a little love, I thought these things might look like saplings. I used a few other bits in similar ways, and I even chopped up the upper back section from a leftover Tree Lord model. Nice. And while I already had these sprues out, I also realized that I had some little bugs left on them, and so I grabbed a few of them off and stuck them to the little saplings I've created. Adding bits like this creates a ton of visual intrigue, while also giving the illusion that the forest is alive. Next, I took some stone things that I often use for basing, and I got these at a craft store for a few bucks. I put some white liquid glue on the diorama in corners and on flat areas that I wanted to give a little bit more texture and interest. I sprinkled some of the stones on each spot and shook them off at the end to remove the excess. I did a similar process with even smaller pebbles in an effort to give more texture variation to this forest floor. I also decided that I would use a couple of the arrow holder bug things from a leftover Kurnoth Hunter sprue on this. I decided to put these guys toward the back of the diorama where I expect to have my Gossamed archers stand, and that'll tell a little bit of a story. I like to think that maybe the archers use some of the same magic as the Kurnoth hunters to get extra arrows for their quivers. I grabbed an orc shield I had laying around on a sprue and, well, I chopped it in half so that it looked like it was stuck in the forest mud. I like to imagine that maybe some rabble-rousing orcs got ambushed by the Sylvaneth in these woods, and now an overgrown shield lays here after they all got destroyed. The next thing I want to add here was an overgrown fallen soldier. I don't really collect any armies that aren't order armies, so unfortunately the only bits I had enough of to make a body like I was imagining was Stormcast Eternal stuff. Plus, they're my second largest army, so if I ever try and rope a friend into having a battle with me, they're probably going to be playing the Stormcast. So this is a nice little way to assert my dominance before the battle even starts. Also, for anyone who cares, I googled some lore, and it said that it was theoretically possible for these two factions to fight, so there's my justification. Feel free to write a several thousand word comment in the comments section telling me that I'm wrong. I cut the dumb pin thing off the head and glued it to the body. Then I grabbed the only leg bit that I could find, which was actually from a Praetor, and cut it out of the model. I don't normally do this sort of kit bashing thing, and I have to confess, I really enjoyed chopping up bits like this. I cut a ton of plastic off of this Praetor, and it ended up looking like a leg, which is what I was going for, so that's good. I had to cut it in half to get it in the right pose and fill the small gap that was created with a little piece of dry green stuff I had left over from a previous project. I stuck the foot a little bit into the foam so that it looked like it was sunk into the mud, and built the rest of the model around that. I had to do some major surgery to this model, although I think technically a bunch of the bits on it were actually from the same model to begin with. But for some reason, the sculptor at GW didn't pose this guy laying on the ground for his actual sculpt, so I really had to do the rest. His other leg is, well, it's either deep under the ground or it's totally gone. I'll let you figure it out. I kept chopping and gluing, and eventually pieced together what I think is a pretty good looking model of a fallen Stormcast Eternal. I personally really enjoy the chopped shield and spear, which I think sell the idea of this guy being sunk into the mud. I put a little bit of glue around the model and added some more of the small stones to make it look like there's some dirt and debris and growth on top of his armor. I decided to use some Vallejo diorama FX that I had laying around as a precision way to apply some texture. This stuff is really good at filling small gaps and giving a natural look, so I put it directly against a bunch of the plastic bits that I put on this thing. I also used it to smooth out some of the more square edges that I wasn't interested in keeping around. Now came the time to use real, actual wooden twigs out of a potting soil bags to look like, fallen wooden twigs and stuff, which was a fitting use for them. And speaking of potting soil, now's the time to use it to make our very own mud. I baked some of it in the oven at a very low temperature to kill anything alive that was growing on it, and I put it in a plastic cup and added a bunch of Mod Podge. I also added a few different paint colors to save myself the pain of having to go back all over this stuff with more primer later on, which I kind of ended up doing anyway, but oh well. I started to slap this stuff on all over the ground very loosely. I kind of let it go where it wanted for the most part, but I also made sure not to cover up the tops of the plastic bits that I placed on here. I wanted them to retain their detail for the most part, and this stuff ends up taking over pretty much whatever you put it on, since Mod Podge dries pretty thick. I also left a few of the patches of rocks and such uncovered so that they could retain their texture. I also tried to keep this stuff out of the circles where I expected the models to actually sit, so that they wouldn't have to sit on top of a bunch of bumps and things. It turns out that I made way more of this stuff than I needed, so if you do something like this yourself, make sure you either have an airtight container on hand for the leftovers, or make it in smaller batches so that you don't waste material. Games Workshop and other companies companies sell basing mud like this, and I'll be honest with you when I say that I generally enjoy using that stuff, and I find I have pretty good results with it. In fact, I used it earlier on this model. The only reason I decided not to use the store-bought stuff for the entire model is that I needed a ton of it. I bet that it would have taken 4 or 5 pots of the Games Workshop Sterling Mud to cover this thing, which would cost, if my math is correct, around $40, which is utterly ridiculous. My mixture probably cost something like $2 when you take the materials I actually used. And bear in mind that I also made way more than I needed. I let this stuff dry for a few hours until it stopped being sticky and squishy to the touch. I grabbed some cheap craft paint in the darkest brown that they had, and then mixed a little bit of black in it to make sure that it would look nice and dark underneath everything. I coated pretty much the entire model in this, once again trying not to touch the plastic bits on here since I intend to paint them with nice hobby paint rather than cheap craft paint. And because of that, I would much rather use a good primer on them as opposed to the cheap craft paint itself. Speaking of good primer, once the rest of the ground was dried, I used my good Vallejo black primer on all of the plastic bits. I also painted the edges of the model in black, but I'm not really sure why I did this since I intend to cover up the edges anyway. Oh well, more poor thinking on my part. Now comes what had to be one of my favorite parts of this process. I grabbed some other paint colors, mostly different browns and greens and gray for the rocks, and I started dabbing them onto the base. I sort of thought about where I put the colors, trying to put the gray on edges that looked like rocky stuff and trying to make sure to get different browns on the wood bits and everything else, but the reality is that a real forest has a ton of visual clutter and interest in it, all of which is mixed together in a whole bunch of different colors. By dabbing color on here pretty much at random, I managed to capture the look of a forest floor pretty well. And don't worry if things are looking a little too bright in this step. We're going to apply some washes later on that will darken everything up. I also had a lot of fun painting the plastic bits on this model. You can see that my Stormcast is nice and gold now, but I forgot to record the beginning of painting it, so all you get to see is the other colors and the second coat go on. I threw some red and silver onto the auric shield and silver and browns onto the different spears I had laying around. I wasn't overwhelmingly careful here with any of these coats since my intent is to age and weather all this stuff quite a bit with washes. No need to highlight or glaze or anything like that. It doesn't need to look perfect, it just needs to capture the idea of what we're getting at. For the small shrubs, I used Dryad Bark as a base coat, followed by Mournfang Brown and Gorthor Brown as highlights. I also coated all of the bugs on here in Abaddon Black. Now came the washes. I started to apply several different Games Workshop washes very thickly and randomly to the ground. This will darken things up while simultaneously adding more visual intrigue and color to the scene. I decided to go with my Games Workshop washes, even though they're a little bit more expensive, because I know exactly what they do and I know they're going to behave well in this situation. You probably could homebrew something here, but I find that washes are cheap enough that unless you're really overusing them, it's probably going to be fine. With all of this done, this thing is really starting to look pretty good, but I want to take care of those few small details left that'll really make it all come together. I added a few more highlights to the trees, highlighted and completely painted the insects, and also painted magic arrows being held by the bugs. I also added a few thin layers of dark green to the ends of the saplings to make them look like fresh green wood sprouting, and I highlighted the leaves to give them a little bit more life. With all that done, it was time for the last detail for the ground. I added a bunch of different colors of tufts to the ground in different places, which really started to tie everything together and add more life to the scene. Before calling this diorama done, I traced and cut down some black construction paper to match the shape of the sides of the diorama. I wanted it to look very clean from the sides, and this is a very simple and cheap way to achieve that. Now was the time I was really excited for. It was time to place the miniatures into their spaces, and immediately I realized that in a lot of cases I couldn't because I left bits of stuff stuck to the sides or bottom of the circles. It was a bit of a pain, and I had to use my hobby knife to do some cleanup in order to get the models to fit properly. Once I'd done that and touched up the exposed spots from cleanup, I took some time to position all of the minis in their new homes. I didn't want to forget what went where because it was really important to make sure that things stayed in their same position for the sake of fitting in here. So I used a paint pen to mark the spot on the diorama and on the base of the miniature that went there with a numbering pattern so that I could know exactly which one went where. I placed some construction paper under the front circles as well so that I could label them. And now that all the models are in their spots, we can take a little peek at what this thing looks like totally completed. And of course, the very final step is actually putting this diorama inside of the storage box where it'll live from now on. And with that, we're done. I honestly had so much fun making this video. This was a really fun project that allowed me to step away a little bit from the normal super detailed and realistic style of painting that I normally like to do. I enjoyed being able to sort of slap things on and be a little bit more willy-nilly with my hobby. It was a lot of fun, and doing some kit bashing stuff was really fun as well, so I definitely intend to do more of this type of video in the future. If you liked it and want to see more, please do let me know with a comment or a like. That'll be even more motivation to do it other than just my enjoyment, so I'd really appreciate that. And otherwise, check back in for more hobby videos that I plan to come out with in the near future. So with that, my name is Hero Song, and I will see you next time. Bye-bye.